Let's turn back the pages of history and travel to the heart of Africa in the mid-20th century, where the fertile red soil of Kenya was smoldering with a fire whose heat can still be felt today. This is the story of the Mao Mao uprising of the 1950s, a bloody struggle counted among the darkest chapters of British colonial history. But this is not just a tale of rebellion. It is the story of a people rising up against the snatching of their land, the erasure of their identity, and the violation of human dignity.
To understand this story, we must completely reject the impression that the British propaganda machine imposed on the world's mind for decades. This was not a group of savage, ignorant, or tribal fanatics practicing demonic rituals as they were portrayed. It was an outright white lie, a systematic and heinous deception whose sole purpose was to cover up their own unspeakable crimes and exploitative system.
The truth is that the Mao Mao, which its members themselves called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, KLFA, was a legitimate political and armed struggle for land, freedom, and their basic human rights. The roots of this struggle were embedded in decades of injustice, and its spark ignited when all avenues of peaceful protest were closed. The story begins in 1920, when Kenya was officially declared a British colony, although the process of British influence and occupation had begun much earlier.
The biggest pillar of this colonial system was the seizure of land. European settlers who were shown dreams of a better life and unlimited wealth came to this part of Africa and set their sights on Kenya's most valuable, most fertile, and highest lands. These areas, comprising the central Kenyan highlands, came to be known as the White Highlands. This was not just a piece of land, it was the soul of the Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru tribes, their identity, culture, and the heritage of generations. Their entire social and spiritual system was connected to this land. But for the British, drunk on colonial power, it was merely a marketable commodity. Through a law, more than 28,000 square kilometers of the best land was permanently reserved exclusively for white European settlers. This single decision rendered millions of local inhabitants landless and homeless in an instant, especially the Kikuyu tribe, whose ancestors had lived, farmed, and been buried on this land for centuries. What was the future for these millions of displaced people? They were shown two paths.
Either they were pushed into less fertile, rocky, and overcrowded areas called native reserves, where even basic life facilities were not available. Or, in a cruel twist of history, they were forced to work like slaves for meager wages for white masters on the very farms that were once their own lands. This was not just economic exploitation, it was a complete system of psychological breakdown. Heavy taxes were imposed on them to compel them to work on European farms under all circumstances. Then the notorious Kiponde system was introduced. This was an identity card that every African man was required to wear around his neck at all times. This booklet recorded his employment, movement, and the name of his master. It was in fact a pre-digital era tracking device, a modern form of slavery that monitored their every move. Being caught without a kipande meant arrest, a fine, or forced labor. It was a system that humiliated them on a daily basis and made them feel like inferior creatures in their own land. It wasn't that voices weren't being raised against this oppression. Peaceful political resistance had been ongoing since the 30s. Organizations like the Kikuyu Central Association, KCA, and the later formed Kenya African Union, KAU, which included moderate leaders like Jomo Kenyatta, were demanding their rights through legal and constitutional means. They were demanding the return of their land, political representation, and an end to racial discrimination. But all their requests, all their arguments fell on deaf ears. In 1934, the Carter Land Commission's report hammered the final nail in the coffin. This report gave legal and permanent status to the European occupation of the White Highlands and made it clear that the British government had no intention of returning the land to the local population. It was from the womb of this despair and anger that the ideology of armed struggle was born. The young and radical elements within the movement became convinced that the freedom which had been snatched by the force of the gun could only be won back by the force of the gun. This is where the Kenya Land and Freedom Army was founded, but the world knows it as Mao Mao, and this name too was part of the colonial conspiracy. This name was deliberately popularized by the British to present the movement as an apolitical, savage, and tribal rebellion. There are various theories about the origin of this name. Some say it is a corruption of the Kikuyu words "uma uma," meaning get out, which was a slogan against the settlers. But the real purpose was to suppress the political name of the KLFA and give it a terrifying and uncivilized identity to mislead global public opinion and justify the brutal actions of the British Army. The most powerful tool for organizing and uniting this movement was the oath-taking ceremony. Taking an oath was part of Kikuyu culture, but the KLFA gave it a new revolutionary meaning. It was no longer just a traditional ritual, but became a sacred promise of loyalty to the movement, secrecy, unity, and a commitment to sacrifice one's life for freedom. This oath psychologically freed people from the fear of colonialism and united them for a common cause. It is estimated that by the mid-1950s, almost 90% of the Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru population, including women and children, had taken this oath.
This was a testament to the popular support for the movement. When peaceful avenues were closed, violence began. Mao Mao fighters, often initially armed with traditional weapons, launched guerrilla operations. They attacked the farms of white settlers, colonial government posts, and police stations. Concurrently, they also targeted those Kenyans whom they considered loyalists or traitors. These included local chiefs, government officials, and those who refused to support the movement.
It is a bitter truth that during this entire struggle, while approximately 32 white civilians were killed, thousands of black Kenyans, whom the Mau Mau considered government supporters, were also killed at their hands. This was a complex aspect of a civil war that colonial powers often create under their divide and rule formula. The violence reached a decisive intensity in October 1952 when Senior Chief Waruhio, a very influential and open supporter of the British government, was assassinated in broad daylight in Nairobi. This incident proved to be the last straw for the colonial government.
Kenya's new governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, used this murder as a pretext to obtain permission from London to declare a state of emergency. On October 20, 1952, a state of emergency was imposed in Kenya, and with it began a new era of oppression and violence. The very next day, under Operation Jock Scott, the entire leadership of the Kenya African Union, including Jomo Kenyatta, was arrested.
The irony was that Kenyatta's direct connection to the armed activities of Mau Mau could never be proven. But the British needed a mastermind for their narrative, and Kenyatta was the most suitable fit for this role. However, the real guerrilla commanders, like the legendary Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi and General China, evaded capture and went into the dense forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares, from where they launched a long and bloody guerrilla war. What the British government did next, in the name of a counter-offensive, is one of the darkest chapters in human history.
Approximately 55,000 troops were deployed, including British soldiers, African soldiers of the King's African Rifles, and the Kenya Regiment composed of white settlers. But the most heinous aspect of this war was using the local population against each other. About 25,000 local people, mostly Kikuyu, were armed as the Home Guard and used against the Mau Mau and their sympathizers. These Home Guards often inflicted the worst violence on their own people. In April 1954, the city of Nairobi was besieged under Operation Anvil, and a month-long house-to-house search campaign was conducted.
Thousands of Kikuyu men, women, and children were rounded up and moved to detention camps. The colonial government adopted a policy of collective punishment. The Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru tribes were collectively declared rebellious, and their lives were made miserable. Over 300 of their schools were closed because the government suspected that nationalism was being taught there. Curfews were imposed, and thousands of their livestock, which were their entire world, were confiscated. People were subjected to forced labor. But the biggest and most devastating plan of the British strategy was villagization. The stated purpose of this plan was to cut off the Mao Mao guerrillas from the populace, to block their access to food, information, and new recruits. Under this plan, more than 1 million Kikuyu inhabitants from the villages of central Kenya, that is, almost the entire rural population, were forcibly evicted from their homes and farms and relocated to about 800 newly created camp-like villages. These villages were called protected villages, but in reality, they were open-air prisons behind barbed wire, deep trenches, and watchtowers with armed guards.
Life inside these camps was worse than hell. Severe overcrowding, lack of sanitation, disease epidemics, food shortages, and above all, forced labor were the norm. Everyone, including women and children, was forced to perform tasks like digging trenches for the protection of these villages. This policy completely destroyed the social structure of Kikuyu society, their culture, and their family system. The deep psychological wounds it inflicted have perhaps not healed to this day. The pinnacle of this oppression was the system of detention camps known as the pipeline.
This was a network of different camps where thousands of suspected Mao Mao sympathizers were held. The purpose of these camps was to extract information from the prisoners, and specifically to make them confess to breaking their oath. Prisoners were classified by color according to their alleged role and intransigence: white, cooperative; gray, less hardcore; and black, extremely hardcore and irredeemable. Prisoners deemed black were sent to the worst camps, where they were subjected to systematic and scientifically applied torture. By 1955, more than 80,000 people were imprisoned in these camps.
The violence that occurred here was not isolated incidents or the work of a few rogue officers, as the British government claimed for a long time. The secret Hounslow Park files that later came to light proved that torture was a systematic official policy adopted by the colonial administration in Kenya with approval from the top. The methods of torture were soul-destroying: beating, flogging, starving, burning, waterboarding, applying electric shocks, sexual violence, rape, and even castration of male prisoners were reported. An attempt was also made to provide a legal justification for this torture. Kenya's Attorney General, Eric Riveth Jones, presented a diabolical legal argument that if the purpose of the violence was to obtain information from a prisoner or to reform them, then the use of reasonable force was permissible. This vague definition gave camp officers a free license for torture, and all of this was happening with the full knowledge and approval of high officials in London, including the Colonial Secretary Alan Lennox Boyd. The most infamous incident of the systematic torture occurred in March 1959 at Hola Camp.
There, some hardcore prisoners had refused to perform forced labor. The camp commandant decided to teach them a lesson. 88 prisoners were taken to a field, and 330 guards beat them with batons and clubs so severely that 11 prisoners died on the spot and dozens were seriously injured. Initially, the authorities tried to cover up the incident, ridiculously claiming that the prisoners had died from drinking contaminated water. But the conscience of a junior officer forced him to tell the truth, and the scandal was exposed on a global scale. The Hola Massacre ripped off the mask of morality from the face of British imperialism and put intense pressure on Britain globally. This event certainly accelerated Kenya's process of independence. As independence drew nearer, the colonial government began a systematic campaign to destroy evidence of its crimes, codenamed Operation Legacy. Thousands of sensitive official documents containing evidence of torture, murder, and other atrocities were either burned or secretly transferred to Britain. More than 1,500 highly critical files were hidden in the secret archives of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office at Hounslow Park near London. This was a deliberate attempt to distort history and bury the truth forever. An honest police commissioner like Arthur Young, who tried to investigate these crimes in 1954, faced intense opposition from Governor Baring and the Attorney General, and ultimately had to resign after seeing the obstacles in the path of justice. But the truth cannot stay buried for long.
Decades later, in 2009, 5 elderly Kenyan citizens who had been victims of British torture during the emergency filed a lawsuit against the British government in the London High Court. It was during the hearing of this case that the British government was forced to admit the existence of thousands of secret files at Hounslow Park. These files provided irrefutable proof of the victims' claims. In June 2013,
the British government announced compensation of approximately £20 million for 5,228 Kenyan victims.
The then British Foreign Secretary William Hague expressed regret for these events in Parliament and acknowledged that torture had occurred, but he refrained from offering a formal apology and cunningly tried to shift the responsibility from the government in London to the colonial administration in Kenya at the time. This was a hollow admission that contradicted the truth contained in the files. On December 12, 1963, Kenya became independent, and in an interesting turn of history, Jomo Kenyatta, who had been imprisoned by the British as the leader of the Mao Mao, became the first president of independent Kenya.
But after independence, the story of the Mao Mao fighters gives rise to another tragedy. Kenyatta's government, which included many who had sided with the British during the emergency, completely ignored the former Mao Mao fighters. They were not given the status of national heroes, and the fundamental issue of unjust land distribution, for which they had made so many sacrifices, was never fully resolved. Many former fighters and their families lived lives of poverty and obscurity. Even today, the echoes of this past are heard in Kenya.
Recent incidents related to the presence of the British Army, such as the fire in 2021 in Loldaiga during British Army exercises that burned thousands of acres of land, showed that the wounds of the colonial era and the imbalance of power still exist today. The history of the Mau Mau uprising teaches us that freedom is not given as a gift, it has to be seized. It exposes the true brutal nature of colonial rule and emphasizes the importance of acknowledging historical truth.
The deep psychological, social, and cultural wounds inflicted on these fighters, their families, and especially the entire Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru communities took the form of a collective trauma that has lasted for generations. True historical accountability does not just mean paying compensation or expressing regret, but acknowledging past mistakes with complete honesty so that such injustices can be avoided in the future. The story of the Mau Mau is a powerful reminder of the eternal struggle of the human spirit against oppression.